There is a kind of turning point that rarely announces itself. No raised voices, no dramatic exit, no visible collapse. From the outside, almost nothing seems to happen. And yet, within the inner world of a person, the shift can feel like continents moving beneath the surface, a silent earthquake, the kind that rearranges everything without a sound. Carl Jung wrote about transformations like this, moments when the psyche stops reacting in familiar ways and begins reorganizing itself. What unsettles certain personalities is not anger, not retaliation, but something far more disorienting: absence of emotional access. Because there are people who depend, often unconsciously, on emotional reactions from others. And when that reaction disappears, the connection they relied on begins to dissolve. This turning point often comes when a deeply empathetic person reaches a state that looks from the outside like indifference. But it isn't indifference. It isn't bitterness either. It is completion, a quiet inner conclusion. The energy that was once spent trying to understand, to repair, to hold everything together simply stops flowing outward. Jung described processes like this using the language of alchemy, not the literal transformation of metals, but the symbolic transformation of inner experience. Pain is not pushed away, it is endured, examined, and slowly transformed into something steadier, something stronger. What once wounded becomes structure. What once overwhelmed becomes clarity. Many people misunderstand empathy. They assume that to feel deeply is to be fragile, that kindness implies weakness, that sensitivity means a person can be easily broken. But Jung saw something else entirely. He observed individuals whose inner lives were rooted not in appearances or approval, but in direct experience, in authenticity. People who were shaped by what they felt and understood, rather than by how they were perceived. By contrast, there are personalities organized around image and reflection. For them, identity is maintained through feedback, admiration, attention, emotional reactions from others. Without that feedback, their sense of self begins to feel unstable. Not because they are malicious, but because they are dependent on what comes from outside rather than what exists within. This difference creates a powerful dynamic. One person feels and absorbs. The other performs and seeks response. One offers understanding. The other seeks affirmation. And for a time, the exchange appears to work. But only for a time. Because empathy without limits becomes depletion. Giving without boundaries becomes exhaustion. And eventually, exhaustion forces awareness. When that awareness arrives, something subtle but decisive changes. The empathetic person stops reacting in predictable ways. They stop explaining themselves endlessly. They stop defending what they know to be real. They stop trying to convince someone who has no intention of understanding. The arguments fade. The urgency disappears. And in its place, there is a calm that feels almost unfamiliar. Jung warned that the most profound psychological changes are rarely dramatic. They are integrative. Parts of the self that were once suppressed, anger, discernment, the instinct to step back, are no longer rejected. They are acknowledged, accepted, and brought into balance. And when this happens, a person does not become cruel or cold. They become clear. Jung used the term enantiodromia to describe the tendency of extremes to transform into their opposites. Excessive self-sacrifice can turn into self-possession. Endless accommodation can give way to quiet authority. Silence can become presence. And presence, especially calm presence, is deeply unsettling to those who depend on emotional turbulence. Because turbulence can be steered, calm cannot. What often surprises people is that this shift does not involve confrontation. There is no dramatic reckoning, no final speech, no attempt to expose or defeat anyone. The change is internal. Access is withdrawn, not with anger, but with quiet certainty. Emotional hooks find nothing to catch. Provocations fall flat. The familiar patterns no longer function. Jung believed that this stage marks the beginning of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming whole. Not perfect, not morally superior, whole. a state in which a person's sense of identity is no longer fragmented or dependent on constant validation from the outside world. From the outside, such a person may seem calm, even distant, but internally, something remarkable has happened. The need for closure fades, the urge to be understood softens, the compulsion to fix others disappears. Life energy, once scattered outward, returns to its source. And when that happens, something else becomes unavoidable. Anyone who relied on that outward flow of attention or emotional engagement is left facing themselves, often without distraction. For some, that confrontation is deeply uncomfortable because it exposes an inner emptiness that had long been masked by noise and activity. This is the true turning point. The moment when suffering begins to yield insight, when emotional pain begins to organize itself into wisdom, when empathy stops being self-erasure and becomes perception, not power over others but power within. From here, the journey does not end. In many ways, it begins. Because this transformation tends to unfold in recognizable phases, stages of awareness and integration that Jung observed long before modern psychology gave them new language. In the next part, we'll explore those stages, how empathy evolves from unconscious absorption to painful awakening, and finally to a form of grounded presence that cannot be easily manipulated. Part 2. The 3 stages of the awakening. Although Carl Jung never used the modern language people use today, he clearly described individuals whose attention naturally moved toward the emotional and symbolic layers of life. People who sensed undercurrents in conversations, who reacted to atmospheres others barely noticed, who were oriented less toward control and more toward meaning. Jung observed that such individuals rarely remain the same across the course of their lives. Their sensitivity, if they reflect on it, tends to push them through a process of change. That change does not happen all at once. It unfolds gradually, often painfully, and it tends to move through distinct phases. Many remain in the first without ever realizing there is another way to live. Others struggle for years in the second, aware but uncertain, seeing patterns but not yet free of them. Only a small number reach the third, not because it is impossible, but because it requires a level of honesty that few people are willing to sustain. The first stage can be called the unconscious stage of empathy. In this phase, a person feels intensely but understands very little about what they are feeling or why. They absorb tension in a room without recognizing it is not their own. They assume responsibility for other people's moods, for conflicts they did not create, for wounds they did not inflict. Emotional intensity feels like closeness. Suffering feels like devotion. Giving more feels like the solution to every problem. At this stage, boundaries feel unnatural, even harsh. Saying no feels like betrayal. Distance feels like abandonment. The person believes, often sincerely, that patience and kindness alone can heal any relationship, that if they just explain more clearly, forgive more deeply, endure a little longer, something will finally change. Jung would say that such a person is entangled in projections, carrying emotions and conflicts that do not fully belong to them. And there are personalities who, often without conscious intent, gravitate toward this openness. They sense receptivity. They sense understanding. They sense a willingness to listen without resistance. What feels like a rare connection to one person may, to the other, simply feel like relief. Relief at being mirrored, validated, or soothed. Both individuals believe something meaningful is happening, but for very different reasons. Eventually, however, strain begins to appear. The person who gives begins to feel exhausted in ways that rest does not fix. Confusion replaces certainty. The same arguments repeat. The same promises dissolve. And slowly, almost reluctantly, awareness begins to surface. That awareness marks the beginning of the second stage, the wounded stage of awakening. This is often the most disorienting part of the process because clarity arrives before strength does. A person begins to see patterns they once ignored. They notice cycles of blame, cycles of reconciliation, cycles that repeat with small variations but identical outcomes. They begin to ask different questions, not only about others, but about themselves. Why do I stay? Why do I accept what hurts me? Why do I feel guilty for protecting myself? Jung described this phase as an encounter with the shadow, not the shadow of another person, but one's own. Emotions that were long suppressed begin to surface. Anger, resentment, the instinct to withdraw, the quiet voice that says something is not right. These feelings can be frightening, especially for someone who has built an identity around patience and understanding. The inner world becomes a place of tension. Compassion pulls in one direction, self-preservation in another. Moments of clarity alternate with moments of doubt. One day the person feels ready to leave. The next they feel responsible again, pulled back by memory, by hope, by the fear of being unfair. During this stage, unhealthy dynamics often intensify rather than fade. When patterns are questioned, resistance appears. Subtle distortions of reality become more frequent. Apologies are followed by repetition. Affection alternates with withdrawal. Not always consciously, but urgently, as if something is trying to hold itself together. Jung observed that once a person becomes conscious of a pattern, that pattern begins to lose its power. But it does not disappear immediately. Awareness weakens the structure, but integration takes time. Seeing clearly does not instantly erase emotional bonds. Understanding a cycle does not instantly free someone from it. This is why the second stage often feels like standing between two worlds, no longer able to believe the old narrative, but not yet anchored in a new one. It is uncomfortable, unstable, and at times deeply lonely. Yet it is also the gateway to change. Because eventually, if awareness continues, something steadier begins to form. A person stops arguing with what they see. They stop trying to reshape reality into something more comforting. They begin to trust their own perception, even when it contradicts what others insist is true. This marks the beginning of the third stage, the stage of grounded empathy. Here, empathy does not disappear. It matures. The person still feels deeply, but feeling no longer means merging. They can listen without absorbing, understand without surrendering, care without losing themselves. Emotions are observed rather than immediately carried. Communication becomes simpler. Fewer explanations, fewer defenses. Words are chosen carefully, spoken once and then allowed to stand. The need to persuade fades, replaced by a quiet confidence in one's own perception. What has changed is not the heart, but the center of gravity. Identity is no longer anchored in being needed or approved of. It is anchored internally. Jung described this as the development of inner authority, the gradual organization of the psyche around a deeper center, rather than around reactions from the outside world. A person in this stage is not cold or detached. On the contrary, they are often calmer, more attentive, more precise in their compassion. But their compassion is no longer automatic. It is chosen, and because it is chosen, it has boundaries. This calm presence can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling, to those who are accustomed to emotional volatility. Attempts to provoke reactions meet silence or measured responses. Guilt fails to take root. Urgency dissolves in the absence of panic. The patterns that once functioned effortlessly no longer find a place to attach. Often, this shift is sensed before it is understood. The atmosphere changes, conversations feel different. The person who once reacted immediately now pauses, listens, and sometimes simply walks away. Not in anger, not in drama, but in quiet certainty. And that certainty is difficult to influence because it does not depend on approval or validation. It comes from alignment within. Reaching this stage does not mean life becomes easy. It means life becomes real. Relationships become clearer. Choices become simpler. Energy that was once scattered returns, and with it, a sense of steadiness that cannot be easily shaken. In the next part, we'll look more closely at how this transformation unfolds internally, the sequence of psychological shifts that allow awareness to become integration, and why some patterns collapse the moment emotional participation is withdrawn. Part 3. The inner sequence of transformation. Carl Jung believed that lasting psychological change does not come from simply deciding to think differently. It happens when the structure of the inner world begins to reorganize itself. Not through slogans, not through forcing emotions away, but through an honest encounter with what has long been avoided. At this point, the process stops being purely emotional and becomes structural, something deeper than mood or temporary insight. To understand this shift, it helps to see it as a progression, a sequence of inner movements that tend to unfold in order. Not a formula, not a technique, but a pattern that appears again and again when a person begins to reclaim their inner life. The first movement is recognition. Recognition can feel abrupt, even harsh, because it interrupts comforting stories. A person begins to notice repetition where they once saw isolated incidents. They begin to see patterns in behavior, in conversations, in promises that dissolve and conflicts that return unchanged. The question slowly changes. Instead of asking why someone else behaves a certain way, they begin asking why they themselves continue to remain in the same cycle. Jung often emphasized that projection loses its hold when responsibility returns to the self. This is not about blame. It is about clarity. A person recognizes that their generosity may have had no boundaries, that their loyalty may have been offered where it was not valued, that exhaustion is not a failure, but information. And once confusion begins to clear, the leverage of manipulation weakens, because manipulation depends on uncertainty and self-doubt. The second movement is integration. This stage is frequently misunderstood, because integration does not mean excusing harmful behavior or suddenly feeling at peace with everything that happened. It means acknowledging parts of oneself that were pushed aside, the anger that signals a crossed line, the instinct to step back, the capacity to refuse without guilt. Jung warned that what is suppressed does not disappear. It continues to act from beneath awareness, shaping choices in ways that feel automatic. When these disowned parts are accepted, something shifts. Anger becomes information rather than eruption. Firmness becomes possible without cruelty. A person becomes less predictable in the ways that once kept unhealthy patterns alive. And with that unpredictability comes a subtle sense of freedom. During this phase, many people notice an unexpected change. They may feel less emotionally turbulent, yet more alive. Less reactive, yet more present. This is not numbness. It is coherence. The inner world begins to feel unified rather than divided, and energy that was once spent managing inner conflict becomes available again. The third movement is separation. Separation is often misunderstood as physical distance, but it begins inwardly. It is the quiet decision to stop explaining one's inner experience to someone determined not to understand it. It is the choice to stop debating obvious distortions, to stop chasing accountability that never arrives, to stop investing energy in conversations that only circle back to the same place. Jung described this as withdrawing projections, allowing emotional energy to return to its source. When that happens, the dynamic changes in a way that can feel startling. Without reactions, without urgency, without the familiar cycle of conflict and reconciliation, the connection loses its fuel. What emerges in its place is not rejection, but a kind of absence. Not hostility, but irrelevance. And irrelevance can feel more unsettling than anger, because anger still acknowledges connection, while indifference quietly dissolves it. At this stage, attempts to provoke reaction often increase. There may be sudden kindness, sudden criticism, unexpected messages, anything that might reawaken the old pattern. But the person who has begun separating inwardly does not respond in the same way. Not because they are cold, but because the emotional hooks no longer find a place to attach. The fourth movement is embodiment. This is the point at which change is no longer something a person thinks about. It becomes something they are. The nervous system begins to settle. Speech slows. Silence no longer feels uncomfortable. Decisions are made with less hesitation because they are guided by an inner reference point rather than by the shifting expectations of others. Jung believed that this is when the deeper center of the psyche begins to take its place, when identity is organized not around fear or approval, but around a sense of inner alignment. From this position, many forms of manipulation simply fail to register because they depend on triggering insecurity, urgency, or guilt. Reactions that no longer dominate the inner world. At this stage, it also becomes possible to see more clearly the difference between unconscious emotional dependence and conscious empathy. Unconscious dependence feeds on reaction. It requires constant reassurance, constant engagement, constant emotional movement. Without that supply, it begins to weaken. Conscious empathy, by contrast, operates from choice. It does not require constant involvement. It can feel deeply without becoming entangled. It can care without surrendering autonomy. A person who reaches this level of awareness does not stop feeling. They simply stop dissolving into what they feel. They can recognize suffering without absorbing it, recognize conflict without becoming defined by it, recognize manipulation without needing to fight it. And this quiet steadiness often has a powerful effect on those around them. Not through force, not through confrontation, but through the absence of reaction. Patterns that once depended on emotional participation begin to collapse on their own, like structures that cannot stand without support. In the final part, we'll explore what this integration ultimately gives rise to, the kind of presence that emerges when empathy and strength are no longer in conflict, and what it means to move through the world with a sense of inner authority that does not need to be defended. Part 4. When empathy and strength become one. Carl Jung never suggested that the aim of psychological growth was simply to become agreeable or virtuous. He believed the aim was wholeness. Good intentions without strength tend to collapse under pressure, while strength without empathy hardens into domination. But when both qualities mature together, something far more balanced appears. A person who can feel deeply without being ruled by what they feel. A person who can stand firmly without losing their humanity. This is sometimes described as the emergence of the integrated individual. An integrated person is not someone who fights constantly or seeks to prove themselves. The real struggle has already taken place within. They have faced their own contradictions, their own fears, their own capacity for anger and withdrawal. And instead of denying those parts, they have learned to live with them consciously. The conflict that once existed between who they felt they should be and who they truly were begins to dissolve. Such a person does not move through the world looking for opponents. They are not preoccupied with exposing others or correcting everyone around them. They simply live in a way that is internally consistent, and that consistency quietly changes the nature of their relationships. Arguments lose their pull. Provocations lose their urgency. Situations that once demanded emotional reaction now pass without leaving much trace. Jung observed that when the deeper center of the psyche becomes stable, external chaos loses much of its authority. A person no longer feels compelled to win every disagreement or to be believed by everyone. Their sense of reality is no longer fragile, no longer dependent on outside confirmation. It rests on direct experience, on reflection, on an inner clarity that does not need constant reinforcement. This is often the point at which certain relationships begin to fade naturally, not through dramatic endings, but through a gradual recognition that the old dynamic no longer functions. Where there was once intense engagement, there is now quiet distance. Where there was once emotional turbulence, there is steadiness. And without the reactions that once sustained the connection, the bond slowly loosens on its own. Jung wrote extensively about the persona, the social mask that allows individuals to function in society. The persona is not inherently false, it is necessary. But when a person becomes identified entirely with the mask, when appearance replaces substance, life becomes a performance that can never pause. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to maintain the image, to defend it, to seek reassurance that it still holds. An integrated individual no longer depends on the mask in the same way. They can still play roles when needed, but they are not confined by them. They know who they are beneath the roles, and that knowledge creates a quiet kind of freedom. They do not need to be constantly seen or validated because their sense of self does not vanish in silence. This difference can feel unsettling to those who are accustomed to relationships built on emotional intensity or constant affirmation. Calm attention, steady boundaries, and the absence of dramatic reaction create a space where illusions become harder to maintain, not because anyone is attacking them, but because there is nothing left to support them. There is a certain irony in this process. Many people who develop this steadiness never set out to gain any form of power. Often they were simply trying to understand their own pain, to find relief from confusion, to stop repeating patterns that left them exhausted. Yet in learning to remain present, to trust their perception, to accept themselves fully, they acquire a kind of influence that does not rely on force. It is the influence of stability. A person who no longer abandons themselves cannot be easily pulled into cycles that depend on self-doubt or guilt. They do not rush to rescue others at the cost of their own well-being. They do not reinterpret harmful behavior to make it easier to tolerate. They step away from situations that demand the erasure of their identity, and in doing so, they often reveal how fragile those systems were to begin with. Jung once wrote that accepting oneself completely is among the most difficult tasks a human being can face. It requires acknowledging not only the admirable qualities, but also the limits, the anger, the fears, the impulses that are less comfortable to see. Yet it is precisely this acceptance that creates inner authority, because nothing essential is being denied or pushed into the dark. From that authority comes a form of presence that is difficult to challenge, not because it is aggressive, but because it is grounded. It does not need to argue constantly. It does not need to convince. It simply stands, steady and attentive, responding when necessary, remaining silent when words would serve no purpose. Empathy in this state is no longer endless giving. It becomes perception, the ability to sense what is real beneath appearances, to recognize sincerity and pretense, to feel compassion without surrendering clarity. Sensitivity becomes a strength rather than a vulnerability, because it is guided by awareness rather than by compulsion. And when this process reaches its natural resting point, something subtle but profound becomes clear. The person who once felt overwhelmed by the world now moves through it with a sense of balance, not untouched by difficulty, not immune to loss or pain, but anchored, present, whole. Truth, when it is lived rather than argued, has a quiet quality. It does not chase approval. It does not demand agreement. It does not need to raise its voice. It simply remains steady and unmistakable for anyone who is ready to see it.